line this morning. I think it would be news if there were no problems on the red line. So people will be arriving little by little, but we thought we would get a start here this morning. I have one very, very, very important announcement, and that is that coffee and pastries and things will be available to those who stay to the end. So we're trying this as an experiment. We'll see if it works. But there will be, if you hang in there, pastries and coffee, etc. So my name is Eric Olson. I'm the Associate Director of the Latin American Program here at the Wilson Center. And I want to just call on my colleague and dear friend, Cynthia Arnson, the Director of the Latin American Program, who's going to give us a word of welcome.
Thank you, Eric, and thanks to all of you who have traveled from near and far, particularly those who are longstanding members of the Wilson Center community as former fellows. Secretary Blackwell, we're delighted to have you back. This event is co-sponsored between the Wilson Center and American University that has been involved in a project financed by the IDRC of Canada to look at specific countries and specific subregions and look at the ingredients that contribute to crime and violence and also come up with solutions. This event is part of a long-standing series that we've had exploring citizen security and the public policies that can address the root causes of violence, prevention strategies, strategies to improve police training and police effectiveness, as well as build the rule of law. So I would not like to take any more of your time, but it's really a pleasure to have all of you here. The event, if I'm not mistaken, is being webcast, so
yes,
there will be an opportunity if you're joining us from an audience outside of Washington to email a question that we can ask of the panelists later. I'd like to also recognize my friend and colleague, Eric Hirschberg, the director of the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at American University, longtime expert and leading intellectual figure in the study of Latin American politics and society. So we're, again, delighted to have you here today. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll just call on Eric, who's going to set the context a little bit for this morning's event.
Well, thank you, Eric, and thank you also, Cynthia, for those very kind words. As Cynthia just mentioned, I'm from American University. I'm on the faculty in the Department of Government and direct the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. And this event is co-sponsored between the Latin America program at Wilson, the Urban Sustainability program at Wilson, and then two programs at American, the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, and also a new Center for Metropolitan Studies, which we're very excited about. And I saw a moment ago Derek Heyer, the new director. Yeah. And so just to give you some brief context about this panel and the project from which the projects, I should say, from which it arises. The Center at AU has undertaken a number of projects with the Central American offices of the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences, FLACSO, and particularly with FLACSO Costa Rica. And 2 years ago, under the direction of Juan Pablo Perez Sainz, a sociologist who joined us from Costa Rica without his luggage, joined us late last evening. Under Juan Pablo's direction, FLACSO launched a really innovative program of research looking at social exclusion and urban violence in the region. And that was funded by the Safe and Inclusive Cities program of the IDRC, the International Development Research Center of Canada, as well as Diffid, the international development analog of the UK. And colleagues at the center were invited to engage that FLACSO project in several ways. But in particular to facilitate English language dissemination of projects' results. And we were particularly interested in trying to diffuse the findings in Washington, where we're based. And of course, we were interested in that for a number of reasons, one of which is we think that FLACSO consistently does very good social science. But the other is because clearly the policy debate in Washington regarding Central America and to some extent Latin America more generally is very much focused around the two core questions of that project, which are social exclusion and violence. And so we thought that this effort over a couple of years to look at the intersections is one that we should share as broadly as possible here. And so today's event is in part a result of that collaboration with Flaxo. And we'll also have a working paper in English that will come out in about a month. And any of you who would like to receive a copy of that, please leave a card, and we'd be happy to send you that within the next weeks. But this event also brings us some insights from two additional projects that were supported by IDRC's Safe and Inclusive Cities program. And one of them will be discussed by Hugo Fruling from the University of Chile, and the other will be discussed by Roberto Briceño, who joins us from Venezuela. And so we're very pleased that in addition to the Central America work that we were involved with, this panel will include findings from ongoing South American projects as well. There will be tomorrow a seminar at the Washington office on Latin America where we're going to focus on some of the conceptual and methodological issues that emerge from these social scientific research projects. And in the event that you're engaged in research on these matters as opposed to policy and practice, we certainly would invite you to join us for that as well. And I believe that flyers for that event are on the table, along with the pastries and coffee. So with that said, by way of introduction, let me again thank everyone for helping to make this panel possible, and to all of you for attending, and I look forward to a very interesting discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Eric. We have 4 panelists who we'll hear from in a minute. I will introduce them briefly. We have fuller bios on the table out there, so I won't go through the entirety of their distinguished careers, but I'll just mention briefly. And then 2 commentators, discussants that will follow. So first we'll hear from Jennifer Salaoub, who is the Senior Program Officer at the International Development Research Center, IDRC. She's an expert in security and development with a focus on urban violence, poverty, and inequality. She manages the IDRC's Safe and Inclusive Cities Initiative, a global research program jointly funded by IDRC and the United Kingdom's Department of International Development. Next, we'll hear from Juan Pablo Perez Sainz. He's a sociologist and a researcher at the Latin American Social Sciences Faculty, better known as Flaxo, in Costa Rica. He has worked on various topics related to labor markets, poverty, and economic development, and published in those same areas as well. Thank you, Juan Pablo. Then we'll hear from Roberto Briceño León. He's the coordinator of the Venezuelan Violence Observatory and a former colleague here at the Wilson Center where he was a visiting scholar. He was founder and coordinator of the Group on Violence and Society at the Latin American Social Sciences Council, CLACSO, and since 1983 has served as the director of the Social Sciences Laboratory. Welcome, Roberto. And last but not least, we'll hear from Hugo Fruling. Hugo is director and professor of the University of Chile's Institute of Public Affairs and a former Wilson Center fellow as well. Prior to his current position at the university, he directed the Center for Studies on Public Safety in Santiago, Chile. And between 1992 and 94, he was executive secretary of the Public Security Coordinating Council in Chile's Ministry of the Interior and advisor to the Minister of the Interior. And I should just add that I have always looked up to Hugo. He was one of the first ones to write a great deal of work on police and police reform in Latin America, and had an influence on me as well. So it's always a pleasure to see you and hear from you. And then we also have 2 stellar commentators. We'll be start with Ambassador Adam Blackwell, who is the Secretary for Multidimensional Security at the Organization of American States. Since joining the OAS in 2006, Secretary Blackwell has served as Assistant Secretary for Finance and Administration, and later as Secretary for External Relations. And as the Secretary for Multilateral Security, we've had occasion to cooperate and collaborate with him on numerous occasions and have just published 2 of his essays on public security based on his distinguished career at the OAS as the Secretary. And then, last but not least, Adriana Beltran, who is the Senior Associate for the Citizen Security at the Washington Office on Latin America, and focuses on violence prevention and police and judicial reforms in Central America. In addition to her work on citizen security, Ms. Beltran has worked extensively on human rights and organized crime, particularly in Guatemala. She was the co-author of a groundbreaking book or study called Hidden Powers, which documents the rise and impact of clandestine criminal organizations in Guatemala following the 1996 peace accord. So we have an extensive panel. I'm going to try to be disciplined, gentlemen and lady. Keep you to, 2, yes. All right. Keep you to 12 minutes. If you see me frantically giving the choking sign, please wrap up. Okay, so we'll start with Jennifer. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Eric, and both Erics for the warm introduction. Okay, great. That's up there. That's me. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for coming today. I'm going to try and keep my remarks brief so that we have time to hear from the real reason that you're here. But before we get to the much more substantive programs, I'd like to tell you a bit more about the program that these 3 gentlemen are part of and give you some background on a global research initiative jointly funded by Canada's International Development Research Centre and the UK's Department for International Development. And I should caution you that I have been battling a terrible head cold for the last week, and so I apologize in advance if I need to make use of this. So Safe and Inclusive Cities, the name of the program, is an $11 million 5-year initiative that's supporting 15 research teams to undertake research in 40 cities across Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia, the global distribution of which is shown on this map. Their mission is twofold. First, to document the connections between urban violence, poverty, and inequalities, and second, to identify the most effective strategies for addressing these challenges, that is to say, figuring out which interventions work and which don't. So why are IDRC and Diffid investing in solutions to violence? The answer to that is that violence has emerged as one of the central challenges to international development. The World Bank estimates that 1.5 billion people live in contexts affected by repeated cycles of political and criminal violence. And as this map indicates, countries experiencing the highest homicide rates are located in the global south and concentrated in the Americas and sub-Saharan Africa. And the epicenter of this violence is more often than not located in the urban centers of low and middle income countries. In fact, 9 out of 10 violent deaths occur outside of war zones, mainly in cities. Criminal and organized violence, often associated with the drug trade, are spreading violently throughout our cities, and the direct and indirect costs of this violence are immense. As part of this program, we have 3 projects based in Latin America, as well as 3 cross-regional projects, i.e. projects that are based in more than one region, that include Latin America. These projects are addressing themes that include different aspects of social cohesion, and if my notes were working, that would help, including community responses in 2 very different Central American contexts that Juan Pablo will tell us more about, testing social disorganization theory in 3 South American cities that Hugo will tell us about, and analyzing the effects of a violence reduction program, the UPP, on social cohesion in Rio de Janeiro. And unfortunately, we don't have a representative of that project with us today. Additionally, the role that social and state institutions have to play in mediating violence in Venezuelan cities, which you'll hear more about from Roberto, and how the interaction of state and market forces affects communities in a particular space from a social justice perspective. In the presentations from my colleagues that will follow, we'll hear about the specific findings of each project, but zooming out to a bit more of a regional perspective, my colleagues at IDRC and I think that there are 4 key lessons that these projects are pointing to. First, technology. First, each of the projects recognizes that effective policies have to be locally adapted and understand the diversity of micro-realities, by which we mean that creating security and inclusion is a challenge that needs to be addressed on a neighborhood-to-neighborhood basis, not necessarily on a city-to-city basis. In fact, the city is often too large of a unit of analysis. Indeed, both the Flaxo and the Universidad de Chile projects focus on refining methodologies and undertaking comparisons at that level. Second, understandings of community responses have to be grounded in assessments of when and how communities are present, rather than assuming that they exist and function as a cohesive unit. And this we'll hear more about in Costa Rica and El Salvador. Third, rather than focusing on the presence or absence of the state, the Chile and Venezuela projects look at how the state can be efficient in dealing with challenges by working at different levels and with different configurations of state actors working in and on the same territory. And finally, in the Latin American region as a whole, and there we go, the interactions between social integration, economic inclusion, organized and disorganized crime, and political settlements are complex and changing. Chile, Venezuela, El Salvador, Costa Rica, and Colombia offer a range of compelling comparative cases to cover the region. So, as I say, I want to keep my remarks short so that we have more time for discussion and to hear from our colleagues. So I will end there and invite you to find out more about the projects, these 3 projects and the others on our website. We have some information available in Spanish, not all of it, but the website is there, or please feel free to approach me after the presentation. I'd be happy to tell you more. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Now let's hear from one Pablo Perez Sainz from Flaxo in Costa Rica.
Okay. Sí, pero yo creo que yo voy más. You pass. Okay. Okay. Okay, good morning, and thank you for the invitation. Our project was on exclusion, violence, and community responses in Central America. So we were dealing with 3 basic problematics: social exclusion, violence, and answers or responses coming from the communities. We developed the research in 9 communities, 6 in El Salvador and 3 in Costa Rica, all of them in urban areas, metropolitan and non-metropolitan areas, and we combine quantitative with qualitative methods, a mixed methodology. I'm not going to the... I'm not going to the results of the research, but just only to develop 3 basic thoughts for policy making that came out of the project. The first one is that the system of a community as a social actor, that is to say, organize and mobilize, cannot be taken as granted. We found empirical evidence why this is so. There are territorial factors, there are social factors, and there are factors associated to violence that prevent the constitution of a community. Okay, I can develop further these factors if there is interest and there is any question about it. This has twofold consequences for policy. First one is that all intervention facing violence comes from outside the community. And on the other side, these kinds of intervention has as one of the main objectives the constitution of the community as such. There are a number of factors that we found out that can develop or hinder the constitution of a community. There are traditional factors that have been found in other studies, like leadership, types of organization, women participation, which is a crucial factor, political clientelism, and the presence of the absence of institutions in the communities, especially local governments. The second thought has to do with the necessity to identify different types of violence and to balance their importance. We found the 3 types of violence. The first one is what we call the contextual violence. that differs from Costa Rican cases to the Salvadorian cases. In the case of Costa Rican community, has to do with the development of the micro markets of drugs. And in the case of El Salvador, obviously with the presence of the young guns, the so-called maras. In relation to contextual violence, the important thing to point out is that they are determined mainly by exogenous factors. Social exclusion in their economic and political manifestations. A very important factor is also the transformation of Central America as a new corridor for international drug flows. Looking to the other types of violence, what we call the profit-seeking violence and social violence, we found mainly two things. The first one is that the profit-seeking violence, we're talking about assaults, theft, burglary, etc., emerges maybe as the most dangerous form perceived by the settlers of the territories of the communities and also by our main informants. That is to say, is the main threat in the social imaginary. On the contrary, social violence that has to do with intradomestic, intrafamiliar violence and violence among neighbors that happens on a daily basis is silenced and tends to become natural and invisible. One of the things that we find that is important to face is the necessity for a re-equilibrium between these two types of violence. And finally, the third thought has to do with the Salvadorian case and specifically with the maras that we define as an ambiguous phenomenon. Why ambiguous? The nature of ambiguity is on the one side, the maras has the monopoly of the violence in the communities, in the territories. They develop economic extortion, they develop sexual violence against young women, they recruit children, and we should not forget the victims. That sometimes we forget the victims of the maras. But on the other side, the maras, they offer protection against external violence, and they intervene regulating social violence when this kind of violence escalate. When conflicts within the families or conflicts among the neighbors become very prominent, they intervene in order to control them. Now, finally, what will be the policy choice in terms of city security? We have to obviously to differentiate the periphery from the core of the maras. So these thoughts have to do mainly with the periphery of the maras, not so much with the core of the maras. And the policy choice is between social reinsertion versus repression of the maras. And there, what we have found is a number of factors that may affect the policy choice, mainly 4 factors. The first one is the presence or absence of institutions that can challenge the monopoly of the maras in the territories. Second one is the existence of sustainable or non-sustainable economic projects for ex-members of the maras. A third one is the existence or no existence of a hidden agenda by the leaders of the maras. And finally, maybe the most important factor is what kind of logic of city security prevails, if it is the logic of reinsertion or the logic of repression. At the moment we are developing the research, fortunately, we witness a logic of reinsertion, and it was possible to work in the communities. Now seems that the country is going in the other direction, the moment of repression, and I think that research, the one we develop, I don't think will be so easy now to do it in El Salvador. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Roberto Briceño León, coordinator of the Venezuelan Violence Observatory.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for the invitation. We're going to present the result of our research that we carry out in Venezuela. As you know, Venezuela used to be a non-violent country and now is the second in homicide rates in the world. So we are trying to understand why this very high increase in violence in the country and mainly in urban areas and urban cities. The research that we carry out was focused on the analysis of the relationship between violence and social norm, formal and informal institution, what we call in sociology and economy institution. The result that we are going to present, well, mainly not the result, the conclusions that I am going to present are based on the qualitative part of the study, that is the first phase. The second phase is a national survey, and this was based on focus group, in-depth interviews, and participant observation that we carry out in 4 cities in the country. And then there was also we tried to establish the relationship between violence and institution, and we carry out the research in shanty towns in Caracas and in Ciudad Guayana. This is the areas in Caracas where the research was carried out, and in the frontier, in the border with Colombia, in Estado Táchira, that is 2 cities, San Cristobal and San Antonio, that is a city completely at the border with Colombia. This as well as Guyana. And I'm going to show just a picture from the area of the study and the shanty towns where we work in Caracas. And with that, I asked that we don't really have time for evidence in this. I asked area, and we don't have time for the 2 Erics. For the evidence, so I am going to present some conclusion, 12, less than 1 for each minute. No. The first is relation to prevention. Crime prevention does not work as an isolated policy. That has been the case in Venezuela. They have been focused on prevention, and they say repression, not at all. Law enforcement, not at all. We carry out social policies, and this is the best way to improve the situation in security. That doesn't work. The second is that prevention has been understood as a material prevention, linked to employment, sports, basketball areas, but our conclusion with this study is that it's very important, the regulatory system, the institution, the rule of the game, so that the prevention is mainly a cultural activity, not a material one. And the government decided to mainly focus on employment missions, provide money, scholarship, or whatever, but not the cultural and institutional aspect. The third is that prevention, oh, sorry. I'm singing. Thank you, Florencio. The third is prevention should have an element of punishment to the violator of the rule. The level of impunity in Venezuela is very, very high. I know all around Latin America that is the case, but let's say in Venezuela, more than 92% of the homicides have not investigation, not a single arrest. So in 92% of the homicides, there is not even one arrest. And an arrest means nothing, just the people can go out the next day.
Yeah, we do.
The fourth conclusion is that despite the social representation of law that has been dominant in Venezuela and Latin America, rightly or wrong, is that law is a weapon of the rich and the powerful. What we see and what we found out is that in Venezuela and in the situation of violence, the law is a tool for the poor. It's the only tool that they have. They don't have how to pay private security. They don't have how to pay for lawyers or for the police protection. The only way that they have to protect themselves is through the norms and the law. This is one picture of the 2 Caracas. That is is clear.
Very clear.
Well, half Venezuelan cities, as is evident there, has been built and lived outside the formal law. But what we found is that in absence of the formal law, another informal institution was created. And this informal institution are the real social pacts. This informal institution, that is the agreements and the informal agreements in the shantytown population, where to build, where not, how to arrange and negotiate pacts or negotiate with the criminals. All these informal pacts is very important, and is very important. And what has been interesting in the result is that in the research is that in the Venezuelan situation, and due to the action of the government, this informal institution has been destroyed. And this has created an increased the violence in the city. So there is not rule in the shanty towns, informal rules, to regulate the social life then. Well, when the state lacks fails in protecting the population and then in its responsibility of law enforcement, the population has two models. No? One is the formal model of behavior prescribed by law, but it's not applied at all. And on the other hand, they have, and the opposite, the criminal model of behavior of success. No? And this model that is imposed by the gangs in the shanty town, by the guerrilla or the paramilitary groups in the border, they are really imposed by force, and they really are accepted. So there are some people, some businessmen even, that they say, well, at the end we prefer the guerrilla rule than the government rule, because they really follow and accept the conditions, and they are really impose the order in the area. The seven is that when a state fails, appears some informal forces that substitute the state. Some are clear, the extrajudicial police action, taking justice into their own hands. Although that in Venezuela there is a censorship for data, criminal data, we know that, for instance, last year, more than 3,000 people were killed by the policemen. And it's a reaction. But let's be saying something more. Last year, just in Caracas, there were 136 policemen killed. More than policemen killed in the U.S. as a country during the year. So in New York, there was a big problem with the 2 policemen killed last year. Well, in Caracas, 2.6 policemen were killed each week. So the policemen decided to act, to react, and to kill in response to this situation. Well, there are also the collective, los colectivos, there are the armed groups there, but there is also a positive response that we found in the research that is linked to the family, the school, and the religion as mechanism of the social control. What is a paradox is this traditional mechanism of social control, the family, the school, and the religion, are going against the trends in the modern state and the modern society. No? But they are the only way that the population has to survive. And they are taking the school and the religion groups as a way to impulse values, to protect themselves, to create some links and the social pact and reinforce the social pact in the community. Well, and in this process of the non-traditional social control mechanism, it's interesting that the key players has been women in different roles. Women as mothers, women as teachers, school teachers, and women as religious nuns in the shanty towns. Then the mechanisms that they created, there are in the research there are very extensive description of these social pacts created by the communities. There is a ceasefire pacts organized by mothers, or the protecting peace mothers in Ciudad Guayana, or the urban social agreements that have been created with some of the municipalities. They are based in a social consensus that replace the formal law, and they are more really accepted. So what is interesting is that in this situation of violence and non-protection of the state, the fail of the state, there has been appears a grassroots social pact, that is now really ruling the everyday life in the shanty towns. Well, but of course, these mechanisms are limited because they don't have the police or some coercive forces to really enforce the rules. It's very difficult to apply. And in certain cases, there are some of the gangs in the shanty towns who really reinforce or enforce this social pacts. In the frontier, in the border, there are some of the guerrilla groups who are really enforce this informal institution and informal law. Well, and finally, in time, but I think that what is interesting is that any prevention program should strengthen formal law, but also the informal regulatory system, the informal institution. This is not possible, and this was something similar to the case in Central America, and that is very important for local authorities, take into account women as key players and the role of mothers, schools, and religion. This is all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being so disciplined in your time. All right, we'll turn next to Hugo Fruhling, Director and Professor at the University of Chile's Institute of Public Affairs.
Okay, thank you. This presentation forms part of a research that tries to explain the diversity in violent crimes among neighborhoods which share the same social disadvantages. And one of the things we try to explain is why is it that this happens? What I'm going to focus today is on the governance system in each of the three cities, capital cities that we are comparing, which are Bogota, Lima, and Santiago. And what I will try to prove is that the governance system is one very critical area in which any international cooperation institution, as well as people interested in reducing crime, has to focus. If we take a look at the three countries, each one of them has a national policy against crime. These were approved, in some cases by parliament, in some cases by the government, and those policies are to be applied in the territory of the three cities as well as in the rest of the country. When we take a look at the three national policies of Peru, Chile, and Colombia, we see that only in the case of Santiago, we do have a national policy which really has the resources, the focalization, the definition of programs, and the capability of coordinating the different ministries that play a role in the crime prevention arena. In the case of Bogota or Colombia, the national policy depends from a consejería which doesn't have the same hierarchy in administrative terms than the ministries, and in the case of Lima, it depends from a national institution and forms a national council and forms part of the national security system, but with very little resources, very little capability for directing a national policy. So one ingredient is we have national policies, but those national policies, when you look at the territory, are really very deficient. Secondly, what about the city's policies? I mean, does each city have a structure to evaluate, implement policies to reduce crime? We know that for a long time we have been advised to decentralize security policies. I mean, the local governments are closer to the community, each reality is different in the country, and therefore we have to decentralize. When we take a look at the three cities, we see that decentralization is clearly not happening in an efficient way. Of the three cities, only Bogota has the structure, the capabilities, and the powers to implement a city policy. And it has the capabilities and the powers to coordinate the municipality of Bogota with all minor localities of the same territory. In the case of Lima and Santiago, we don't really have a city policy. Lima, because the powers of the Lima mayor to coordinate with other municipalities are extremely weak, and because the structure for defining and implementing policies is also very weak. And in the case of Santiago, we don't have a city-wide municipality. We have around 60 municipalities in the whole region of Santiago. Each one has its own policies or its own dedication to the field of security. So we have two structures that are not working quite well. And what are the results of these structures, the national policy as well as the city policy? First of all, there are a series of consequences. The first one is you don't really have, except for the case of Chile, a real robust national policy on crime. We have documents, but they are not working as a policy in terms of deciding the transfer of resources, as well as determining which projects should be terminated and which projects should be implemented. There is a second issue dealing with how the system is supposed to work and how it really works. There is very little participation, except for the case of Lima. Most of the design of the policies are top-down versus bottom-up, and interventions are very much decided by focusing in neighborhoods in accordance to clientelism and political influences rather than evidence. Now, what is the main result in each city, and particularly in Santiago and Lima? There are difficulties to coordinate institutions which depend from different levels of government, national, regional, local. Secondly, and this is even more serious, there's almost no coordination among local governments to deal with common problems, like youth, like desertion from schools, like public schools. Each locality, each municipality works on its own, and there's no internal, way of coordinating their work in accordance, shaped by the same problems. What happens with the difficulties to coordinate institutions which depend from different levels of government? The main expression of that is the difficulties to work with the police. in all three countries, the police is a centralized institution, and local governments have very little to do or to say with what the police does or doesn't. Let's take a look at the projects. We were able to build a data analysis on the projects that had been implemented in the three cities for the past 5 years. And what we see is that only in the case of Bogota, these programs have been initiated by the municipality, the municipal government. In Lima and in Santiago, the impetus for creating programs and implementing programs comes mainly from the central government. Now, if we take a look at the focus of programs, I mean, they are quite diverse, and they tend to be shaped in accordance to what the literature on prevention states. I mean, there are programs dealing with victims, there are programs dealing with reinsertion or of former prisoners, there are programs dealing with psychological support and the like. There is a clear difference between Chile and the other two countries. We could say that the projects represent, in the case of Santiago, a much more criminological approach to the prevention of crime. That is to say, they are focalized in particular territories. They tend not to be confused with social programs, and that is expressed very clearly in the fact that in the case of Chile, there are almost none policies that are not focalized. In the case of Lima and in the case of Bogota, most of the projects tend to be universal. That is to say, they go to all possible persons that could benefit from them. Okay, these are some of the issues that I think come out of this analysis. First of all, I would say that we have focused for many years on policing and on judicial reform. We haven't focused on the process by which different actors and institutions coordinate themselves, work together, and what are the incentives which exist to do that. Much of our effort has been on trying to determine, to identify good practices. But then it's very difficult to understand why is it they are not replicated elsewhere. Unless we have a sharper view on the processes of governance in different cities, it's very difficult to change the way in which the institutions work. Secondly, the decentralization of security policies, which is a very good idea, takes place in cities which have which are work in a context of institutional fragmentation, lack of authority, and a lack of an effective dialogue with the central institutions of government. Crime prevention requires not only multi-level coordination among central, regional, and local governments, but require coordination among local governments themselves. And this has to be done around common interests. That which is not required by law doesn't happen in any of the cities except for Bogota. Only in the case of Bogota, the majority of the projects have been created and implemented by the municipality itself. The other two countries depend, for the most part, from what the central government decides to fund. Now, this is interesting. When you take a look at the diversity of the programs being implemented, they respond to what the literature tells you about what should be done in the area of prevention. So that clearly demonstrates there has been a diffusion of knowledge in Latin American countries about the type of projects that should be implemented. That because of international cooperation, because of interchange of information, etc. However, this variety of programs which are implemented do not clearly have the same type of objectives as stated. We go from a very social approach in the case of Colombia, which is ruled by a mayor who's a leftist, to a more criminological approach in the case of Santiago, where the government was headed by a center-to-right president when we did the research. That is to say, the labels might be the same, but when you look at the focus, the type of programs, the definition of objectives, you see that behind the label there are different approaches that are politically motivated to some extent. Projects in Lima and Bogota tend to be less focused. So they worked in very large areas and they changed their territorial focus, where in the case of Santiago, focalization is better understood. Now, from the point of view of research, from the point of view of government, from the point of view of international cooperation, I think I should stress that we know something about what works somewhere. We know very little about how to transform the flux and interaction among institutions within the security system, so to speak, in Latin America.
Thank you very much. Okay, now we'll turn to our commentators, led first by Secretary Adam Blackwell, Secretary for Multidimensional Security.
Get it, Eric.
I'll get it one of these days. Multinational, multidimensional, at the Organization of American States. Adam?
Thank you, Eric, and thanks to the Wilson Center as I get ready to end my mandate of 5 years as Secretary of Security at the OAS. This is a great opportunity to reflect on what I hear and what I've seen in my travels around the region. And I'm glad to say that most of what I was going to say has really been reflected by the presentations we've heard so far this morning. And one of the things that we tried to pilot in the OAS was a diagnostic of the security sector to be able to really have a look, security system, the sort of ecosystem that is necessary to ensure a successful application of security in our member states. And there's 3 or 4 conclusions to that, which I think are very close to the points or comments made earlier. And the first one is that states cannot relinquish control of territory, security control of territory. And this was Cynthia and I participated in a group in Mexico a couple of days ago, and this was actually one of the points that was reflected there as well. States need integrated, responsive institutions. That this is an ecosystem. This is a chain that has to connect and has to work across organizations as well as vertically. And I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of countries, systems that I have seen where there's a proper integration. I would just do a shout out here to Luis Cardona of Montgomery County. There's an example of how, with not necessarily more money, more resources, which is the assumption most make, but how you can have effective application of policy through a proper integration and coordination. So, you might want to just have a look at how Montgomery County is doing some of their things. And of course, coordination, as some of the panelists have mentioned, the number of diagnostics we've done where the police don't talk to the Attorney General, vice versa, they don't know how to prepare documents, how to conduct an investigation, how to get the forensics right. I mean, it really is appalling. And the fourth one I would say is consistency. You cannot change your approach to policing. You cannot change your approach to institution building every electoral cycle. There needs to be state policies developed here. The second thing I would say, which is more of general nature, I think you do have to unpack these challenges. They are complex. We're not going to solve this in 12-minute presentations. We, and it's one of the documents that the Wilson Center has kindly published, came up with a bit of an equation to look at what is driving situational crime and violence across the region. Because it's not something you can say, oh, Bogota is a violent city, or Baltimore is a violent city, or Caracas is a violent city. It depends. It depends on where you are, in some cases what time of the day you're talking about. And this equation looked at things like social vulnerabilities. What are they? Let's list them. Let's figure out which agencies should be trying to help address some of those concerns. The second component is, what are the institutional fragilities, not just the national level, but at the municipal level, the business sector, the private sector, NGOs. How are you integrating these organizations together? If you have a diversion program for youth at risk, which you've identified in social vulnerabilities, it has to have teeth. It has to have carrot and stick. It can't just be something that's, a cliche. We're going to have a diversion program for youth at risk. There actually has to be institutional backing for this. And the third component of this are accelerants. And I think of drugs as an accelerant. Quite often we think of crime and violence in our region as just an issue of drugs. Well, it isn't, folks. There are a number of other things that are as prevalent as drugs, whether it be gangs, whether it be guns. 80% of the homicides in our region are committed with a firearm. Global average is somewhere around 40. So guns are one of these things that I think are pushing us into a more violent area. Now, specifically to look at urban centers, whether it be our experience in El Salvador with the gang truce or studying Ciudad Juarez. I was in Mexico earlier in my diplomatic career, and I went back just as I started this job, and I went back just last year to have a look at what's going on, and obviously places like Medellin and Rio de Janeiro. And I like to think of the region as a laboratory. There's a lot of great localized experiments going on that now need to either be documented and scaled up or adapted and adjusted to move forward. And what are the key ingredients of those successful practices that I've seen? And the first one is leadership. Strong mayors, strong city councils, but not just formal leadership, informal leadership as well. Community groups, women's groups, neighborhood groups, and integrated leadership across, up and down an organization and across an organization, and relationships with other levels of government, private sector, etc., is absolutely key. The second thing, which some of the panelists mentioned, is what I would call a culture of evidence, not ideology or not interests. We've just published a paper on some reflections on private security. It's a growth business, and in many cases, it's driving some of the response in the wrong direction. But also, what is happening out there? What are the outcomes of some of the policies we've made? Why is the repressive drug policy or prohibition of drug policy failed? Let's have a look. Let's understand what has happened here. Why is over-incarceration not the solution? Why is a repressive approach to gang violence not going to work? So I think we need to be clearer on what we mean by evidence, and we need to try and instill some sense of culture in our decision-making here. The third component I would add is social participation. Obviously, gender is incredibly important, but some of the formal structures are even more important. I remember the faces of the Haitians that we gave identity cards to for the first time in their lives. I mean, this was a huge deal. For the first time in their life, they had an identity card which helped them apply for government services, as weak as they may be, but it was a huge impact. Parks, schools, property rights. One of the successful factors I recall in Rio de Janeiro was even in the favelas giving people partial property rights so they can invest in their home, make it better, have some pride of ownership. The fourth feature, and again something that we've written about recently, is what kind of police do we deserve? What kind of police do we want? And how are we going to create a police that is really there to protect and to serve? And I think that we have not, as a society, really done enough work to really get to the bottom of what our behaviors are, and how that reacts and how that directs what kind of policing that we are going to have. The fifth thing is the investment in what I would call public goods. So transportation networks, metros, bus, the teleférico in Medellin, schools, security, trying to provide lights in parks and lights in football fields and things like that, I think is important. It gives folks a sense of pride. And I think the last thing that I would mention is this need for a very strong multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral approach to all of these things. They're incredibly complex. We need strong NGOs. We need a strong and connected private sector. You need to bring in faith groups into this equation. This is not something that one level of government or one level of society is going to be able to deal with. And I would say the same thing in Vancouver as I would in Tegucigalpa. This idea of bringing people to the table, giving them some skin in this game, developing ownership in these solutions that we are trying to develop. And the only other thing I would like to add is that this is a problem. 43 of the 50 most violent cities on the planet are in our region. As somebody mentioned earlier, we struggle to come up with this new definition of conflict, but we have conflict in the region. You apply the homicide rate to Honduras, to the United States, you have over 300,000 homicides a year in a country which had 14,000 last year. Just imagine the United States with 300,000 homicides a year. This is a conflict, and we need to invest in trying to figure ways to get out of this without trying to incarcerate everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam. You did pretty well. And then finally, let's hear from Adriana Beltran, Senior Associate for Citizen Security at the Washington Office on Latin America.
First, I want to thank the Woodrow Wilson and AU for inviting me to comment. I feel very privileged to be sitting here among such distinguished panel of experts. I'm going to be very, very brief, probably won't even take my 12 minutes, as a lot has been said. But just, to congratulate Idrc and the panelists for this research. I think it's very important. I think it's also very timely, as Eric mentioned. There's a lot of focus right now on Central America with the $1 billion aid request that was made by the administration, the Alliance for Prosperity that the governments of the Northern Triangle have developed to look at a lot of these issues of how do you address questions of social and economic exclusion and the high rates of violence and insecurity that you see in the region. So I'm delighted, to hear more and about the findings of the research. I guess want to highlight a couple of points that to me are very important as we look at policy recommendations. And one, I think, is the need to take into account, as was said, the differences in the dynamics of violence that are experienced in specific communities. As Adam mentioned, there's a tendency to look at the problem of the region in Central America as one just of a question of drugs or of gangs. But I think it's important to emphasize that these communities are really experiencing different, multiple forms of violence, and that we run a very huge risk if we focus policies on just trying to address a singular phenomenon rather than look at these at the multiple forms of violence and the need to really develop and implement differentiated responses. I think the second is the point that was made that violence is really concentrated in geographical and urban communities. I think this is a growing recognition among policymakers that we really need to focus on more specific and targeted geographical analysis and responses. This has been the case, I think, in Central America, where AID has been moving more toward looking at targeted responses to trouble hotspots. And even, I think, in the debate in Central America with the Alliance for Prosperity, that there's a recognition of that need. Third is the interconnectedness that was highlighted between the need to look at the lack of opportunities of dealing with the social exclusion and the fragility of state institutions. I think this is a very important and positive contribution, particularly in the debate right now. And I think it's one of the issues that is at center of the discussions as we look at the aid package to Central America. The need to really emphasize these comprehensive multi-sectoral approaches that are aimed both at trying to improve opportunities. How do you address issues of lack of employment, economic exclusion, but also of providing very stable and decent jobs. Low quality of employment is not really going to provide a viable option for people. And also, how do you address the issue of the need to really focus on the state legitimacy, questions that Adam raised about the police, about addressing corruption and impunity in these countries. And fourth is the issue of the community participation and the role of the communities. I would like to hear more about ideas in terms of how I think the community plays a very important role, but how do you deal with building that social cohesion that is very necessary for communities to really play an important role in driving that change? And fifth, I guess I would stress, and this was mentioned briefly, about the role of nonviolent actors. Adam mentioned the case of El Salvador and the role of the gangs, the fact that you had a gang truce that I think did provide a window of opportunity for the government of El Salvador and the different sectors to really develop more sustainable prevention and reinsertion efforts. And I think it is important, as the research noted, that prevention and reintegration ought to take a priority over repression. But as we all know and we saw, there was a lot of criticism from various sectors about the gang truce. There was tremendous backlash, and I think even the government was very ambivalent about its role in the gang truce. And so I would want to hear more in terms of the research, particularly that was done in Central America, about how these power relationships might have changed between the local gangs and community residents, how they were able to really reconfigure that power relationship, because I think it's important to highlight that in terms of trying to understand better the truce itself. And also in terms of what might be the different roles that the gangs can play in responding to these efforts. There was a lot of concern at the time about the consolidation of the power of the gangs. And I guess my question is if this is a caveat that we have to take or a downside that we have to take into account, or is there a way that you can organize the communities to eventually undermine, I guess, the dominance of the gangs? And I think I would leave it at that.
Great, thank you. I guess I was reflecting along those same lines as we kind of in this country struggle with the tragedy of the broken relationship between the police and communities in Baltimore and Ferguson and probably dozens of other places, and how important that relationship is. And I was struck by what Juan Pablo said at the very outset, that we can't assume that community exists or operates in the same way we would expect it to or want it to in so many of these cases. And as Roberto pointed out, in Caracas, there's communities, but then they operate under informal rules. Those informal rules can get broken, and how difficult that to manage those relationships becomes very difficult in the context of trying to create a context of public security. So thank you all. I don't know if anyone wants to make a quick comment before I open it up to our distinguished audience. Or I don't know if Eric or Cindy have anything they want to throw out here to start with. Anyone on the panel? No? Okay. I want to just give a shout out to my colleagues in the Latin American program. Karina Peña is over here. She has a microphone, so raise your hand. And Alejandra Argueta, our intern, who sadly this is her last day, so we thank her for her role. But if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll take 2 or 3 questions and then let our panelists respond. And we have a good bit of chunk of time. So there's a question here. Cindy?
Sure. As everybody, thank you, Eric, and thanks to all the panelists for these very interesting and provocative and rich presentations. One of the key difficulties in designing public policies to address crime and violence is figuring out not only sequencing, but if you can't do everything at once, if you cannot adopt an integral policy, you can't reform the schools and create jobs and reform the police all at once, what are the 2 or 3 things that are most important to do right away? And my guess is that the answer to that is going to depend on the particular locality. I was struck by Adam Blackwell's comment about the importance, of leadership. If you don't have leadership and you don't have resources, what can you really accomplish? So I guess, it's a question that goes to all of the presentations. We understand the great deficits of institutions, the lack of political will, the levels of impunity, the lack of opportunity. I mean, these problems are transversal and very entrenched. So, how do you begin and where?
Okay, we'll take a couple other questions. Please identify yourself, too.
Hi, Ron Levy from the University of Toronto. I'm very interested in Hugo's point about Bogota and Santiago having very different approaches, and I think implicitly that was linked to the politics around crime prevention and mayoral differences. I'm interested in knowing whether there's also sort of network differences. So whether this is a function of different experts investing at different points. So is there a history to this difference, or is it merely opportunistic politically?
Right. One more. Right over here.
Matthew Taylor, I'm a fellow here and also a professor at American University. I just wanted to identify a tension that I hear across the presentations, which is, I think Adriana said at the end, the necessity or the desire to prioritize prevention and reintegration over repression, which I think is laudable and makes sense as a normative goal. But then several of the presenters also identified impunity as an issue. And so how do you balance those things, and what do successful cases, how do they balance those things? So impunity, whether it's of state actors or impunity of criminals, is something that normatively we would not desire. But at the same time, Latin America has this long history of repression. And so there's a tension there, and I wanted to just hear your comments about that.
Great. Okay, 3 good questions. What do we do first of the many things that are options? The question of Bogota, Santiago, that would probably be Hugo's, and the tension between impunity and prevention, maybe along the lines of what starts first as well there. Any of the panelists, or Adam's looking pretty eager?
Well, not so eager, but I would just say, I mean, this is a really good question that Cynthia's put to the group, and I think that's really at the heart of this discussion. We know where the hot spots are, and in some municipalities you can almost tell by the number of blocks where the violence is the heaviest. And there's a very sophisticated approach by a group called Cure Violence, Dr. Gary Slutkin, who developed sort of a health-based approach where you stop the contagion, you separate the parties, and then you begin to start changing behavior. I mean, it's obviously a lot more sophisticated than I can explain here. I was operating on a very similar approach in El Salvador, based on my experiences in places like Somalia and Eastern Africa, really to try and separate the killers and develop some sense of community with them. And this is really what I think was the first success of the gang truce in El Salvador, is the homicide rate did drop significantly. I think the second unspoken key of this truce is we got to speak to the leaders. We got to them in the same room, and we got to understand a little bit about what was driving this phenomenon called the Mara. And to be able to develop space in some of those 11 communities, which were, misnamed communities without violence. I mean, obviously there was still violence, but you could start to see the small economies, home-based economies regrow, and communities start to, I would say, invest in a normal or semi-normal life. So I really think you've got to separate, like you would do in any conflict anywhere, and the UN has a toolkit that's very well developed here. You got to separate the parties. You got to stop the killing, so you can start to try and create space to have a discussion and to have a dialogue, and that I think is what really is essential here. The second thing is, I will leave the question on Bogota and Santiago to others, but in terms of the balance between impunity and rule and law, there has to be consequences. There has to be cultural consequences. You can't cheat at your exams in school, and that's one. You have to have diversion programs which have consequences, has both carrot and stick. But I always like to say that rule of law in this region has often been misinterpreted or mistranslated as law enforcement. And it's not. It's about having a balanced, humane, and just approach and access to justice. Putting kids who are in the Mara uniform in jail for 2 and 3 years before they see a judge is not justice. And all you have done is created a hardened criminal in 90% of the cases, making reinsertion or reintegration much more difficult. So I think we have to look at balanced approaches, and the President Obama and former Attorney General Holder in this country were starting sentencing reform, and I think that will be probably one of his most positive legacies.
Sure. Yeah. Jennifer, go ahead.
I mean, I don't have terribly a lot to say on this, because the real experts are to my right. But just to respond to a couple of the questions, in terms of sequencing and priorities versus priorities, I would say that, and this is exactly what we're trying to do through Safe and Inclusive Cities, is to identify the drivers. And really, I think what we're learning from these projects and the other 12 is that sometimes the drivers are only identifiable at a very low level, at a very micro level. And so then the responses or the intervention that you design or adapt is going to need to be focused on that micro level. At the same time, I would say that there are two other factors that seem to be important. The first is building trust, and I think that can relate to a number of different levels, whether it's trust between communities or trust between between society and the state. There's a need to rebuild that trust that has crumbled and has created space for this sort of violence. And then lastly, I would say strengthening institutions. And I think that coming out of all three of these projects, different kinds of institutions need to be strengthened. And I think that really relates to building trust and kind of identifying what the drivers are. In terms of prevention versus impunity, the only thing that I would say is that I would agree with Adam's comments and just sort of reinforce that the idea of norms and social pacts and some sort of social sanction, there's a lot of unexplored space there, I think, and clearly we're seeing that mano dura does not work as well as some might hope it would, and certainly the resources that we're putting into incarceration could certainly be, I think, better spent elsewhere and with greater effect.
Hugo?
Yes, in response to Cindy's, that's a big question, and probably the answer is a small one. But I would say that there are two things that you should do first, and in many countries of Latin America, there are, advances, quite extensive advances in the two of them. The first one is you need information, because And that's not that difficult to arrange. Why you need information? Because you have to target places or you have to target groups. And in order to organize programs around those targets, you need information about, expressions of violence, modes of violence, and the like. And it has been difficult, but it's not that difficult. It's technical. It requires coordination between the police and the prosecutor's office and the like, but it's not really a tremendously difficult task to accomplish. The second one, I think, is that you need a viable criminal justice system. And I'm not saying a very effective, I'm not saying there is not going to be impunity, but in fact, in order to create conditions for the communities to be more cohesive, you require that at least, part of the criminal code is implemented and applied, because otherwise, certainly, it's impossible to create any other thing. And I don't think we have accomplished the second step yet, despite investments very extensive on criminal justice reform or on policing and the like, at least until people perceive that these rules are to an important extent applied, and applied not only to the poor but also to the powerful, I think it's very difficult to go beyond that. With respect to differences between Bogota and Chile, you're right. I would say that in the case of Chile, the projects that we examined were implemented under the Piñera's government. And the people at the Ministry of the Interior were very much influenced upon by the idea that you have to implement policies based on evidence, on positivistic, if you wish, evidence, that you should target policies, and therefore instead of giving money to municipalities, they targeted particular neighborhoods. The point of, in the case of Bogota, I would say that is a more traditional approach. In fact, we took a look at a number of projects and programs, but they were not, they had no objectives dealing with reducing crime, and therefore we had to discard them. Now, when you take a look at the micro reality of targeting, you see that it's quite different from what the evidence say, but I won't go into that. And I would say that one of the problems that the Piñera government had was precisely not taking sufficiently into account the political ingredient when you have to implement policies. Therefore, the discourse didn't really match the reality. Well, impunity and repression and the balance between impunity and prevention, we all recognize that prevention is important, and if you take a look at the last report by the UNDP, it is clear that the number of crime prevention programs have increased. Now, if you take a look at the budgets, the difference in budgets is just tremendous. I mean, and if you look at the realities, when I interviewed, for instance, the mayor of Puente Alto, which is the largest or the second largest municipality in Chile, he said, this like a drop in the back. I mean, we get money where we need to attend thousands and thousands of students, and we have a program for only 100. I mean, what difference does it make is hard to know.
Juan Pablo?
Okay, I want to pick up your question about the priorities, and I will go more in a social direction than Hugo, and I will stress as a priority constitutions of communities. Okay? And I think there are, in our research, what we found, I think there are two critical factors. One is the presence of state institutions. I mean, the state abandoned territories in the 80s, okay, and that had created a vacuum for the emergence of other kinds of actors that monopolize violence. And I think the bringing back the state in the communities, I think, is a crucial issue. And the second one is more a symbolic issue. It has to do about the stigmatization of communities by violence. Okay, we know that social exclusion is one of the factors that creates violence, but violence stigmatizes communities and therefore reproduces social exclusions of the people of the communities. And I think it's very important to struggle against these kinds of images between the civilized city versus the barbarian city. I think we have to integrate one city. I think that that struggle on the symbolic field is something that's not taken in account, and I think it's important for the constitution of a community if we want the community to be an actor that face in an effective way violence.
Roberto, you have a...
Yes, in the same direction. Well, I think that the Venezuelan case is a very special case, very difficult. For instance, regarding the 2 points that Hugo mentioned, information, well, we have, instead of information, we have censorship in Venezuela. So it's difficult to talk about information. Instead of a criminal justice system, we have a completely political control criminal system, and we have a minister of prisons that made a statement saying that the Venezuelan prisoners, they are prisoners of capitalism. So it's very difficult to deal with this approach, but well, when we see in the Venezuelan case the balance between the prevention and repression, the government has adopted during the past 15 years a prevention approach, completely a prevention approach. This has been mainly the social and material approach. But I think that they forgot completely the repression component and in the balance. I would say that is, as sociologists, that is politically correct to say that we have to have a balance between prevention and repression, and that is fine, that is correct. But I think in the Venezuelan case, what we need is really in this moment is repression. But that's very difficult, because repression could mean political repression, not law enforcement. So I think it's important to really reveal the idea of the social pact in the communities and the law and the values linked to the law. And that is perhaps this is very special and the Venezuelan case, and we can learn it from the Venezuelan case. I agree with Ambassador Bladwell that putting in jail married teenagers is not the solution. But do nothing could be worse. And that is the case of Venezuela. The Venezuela government decided put in jail is a right-wing policy, and they decided not to do something against these teenagers in the gangs. So the situation is that doing nothing, and they are in the streets with the guns, killing people, and creating more problems. So it's a very difficult balance, but in the case of Venezuela, I think that in this moment repression is important, but meaning repression as law enforcement, as the social pact. And I would say, Cindy, there are 3 aspects for me. One is support values, the normal values in a society. That is important in the Venezuelan case. That is not the same to be an honest worker than a killer. That is important in the Venezuelan case. The second is protection of the family, of the ordinary people, and that means a cooperation of private and public protection, support the police, increase their salaries, a lot of work with but mainly moral support for the policemen and for the police. And the third, I think it's important, punishment. Perhaps not this general punishment mainly linked to the small drug dealers, and not, I think mainly with big criminals linked to homicides and and try to control this scam. And of course, behind that is a struggle against organized crime that is in Venezuela and is increasing their presence, but in a very difficult situation and not clear, because the links with the government and the official is so big that it's difficult to differentiate when is a government policy, when is a organized crime action in certain areas in the society.
Great. Thank you. I think we have time for another round. Questions? There's one here with Margaret.
Thank you very much. You've all mentioned the police. Are there any good stories to be told, lessons to be learned, and successful programs to change the way police are addressing crime, violence, et cetera, and relations with the community? Can we begin to see a trend at all in changing the culture of police forces to deal in a more humanitarian way with this problem?
Okay, right here, Eric has got a question, and is there one in the back here?
Well, thank you all for very interesting interventions. I have two very different questions. One is that a couple of the panelists mentioned something that I think, and Juan Pablo mentioned it in passing, that I think comes out very prominently in the Flaxo study, which is the important role of women in communities in efforts to enhance citizen security, build safe and inclusive cities. And I wonder whether you could elaborate a little bit on how that came up as a central theme out of the research. The other is a very different question, which has to do with the issue of the presence of the state. I have a hunch, and I don't know what one does with this, but I'd be interested in your reactions, that in some instances, yes, it's a problem of the state no longer or never having been present in particular communities. That would, for example, be the case in the Costa Rican cases that the Flaxo team looked at. Roberto's discussing a case of the state being absent in Venezuela. But my sense is in other instances, the problem is that the state is overwhelmingly predatory, and that having the state present simply introduces another toxic actor. So how do you think about determining when it is that what you need is the return of the state, and when it is what you need is the transformation of the state?
Great. There was a third question here in the middle. Alejandro, maybe you can.
Hi, thank you. My name is Edwin Lopez. I'm a student at Georgetown University. I was going to ask a question more to do with the public and how the state really reacts to the public, in the sense that we see as urban violence is rising, when looking at Latino Barometer, etc., it also comes with a rise in public perceptions of insecurity, which means that at the same time, despite the amount of policies that might be being implemented, the public, perhaps because of the different types of violence, still feels insecure. So I guess the question is really, how do we address this rising public perception of insecurity? Because that has a lot to do with trust in the state, and as we were talking about, building communities and building social trust. And are there any policies that have effectively transform that as well.
You want to start, Roberto, and we'll work our way down, or Juan Pablo, is kind of a question to you.
No. Just in relation to women that I mentioned, and I think that in this project there is another very interesting study on masculinities. In the Venezuelan case, there is I think there are two aspects. One is that there is in the culture, and the women is a protector factor in general, and the behavior is in the women behavior and the women cultural behavior is perceived by the teenagers as protective, but at the same time as a behavior linked to the female model. So it's quite interesting because it's protective in one way, but in the other, for the teenagers to follow that model is to follow a female model that they reject for the masculinity. So there's a very important aspect. The second is in relation to the role play for the mother, the teacher, the nuns. That is a different aspect. That is the women as mother, and that is very important for the control of violence. In my case, I think that in the Venezuelan case, I think that we are, of course, thinking is in the transformation of the states, and not the because in Venezuela the government is powerful, control everything, is introduce the regulation of everything, but in practical terms, that doesn't work. So there is nothing. It's a lot of a state and an empty social relation. That's why we are prefer to use in general the idea of institution as the rule of the game. So that could be linked to the state or not, but at the end, the state is the rule of the game. No, it's not the government. That sometimes where we are mentioned as too much present, and this perverse effect is more from the governments, not as the state itself. This is.
Okay, two things. The first about relation about women. I think it expresses an historical role of women in urban marginal areas. Okay, since the 50s in Latin America, urban movements were mainly led by women. Okay, and I think in a certain way, a struggle against violence is in a certain way a continuation of that historical movement. But on the other side, it reproduces also traditional roles of women, because we're talking about the urban as the reproduction sphere. We have a case, maybe the only successful case of community organization, Territorios Seguros in Costa Rica, that is composed by 95% or 99% by women. But a factor explaining why is such a huge participation of women has to do with unemployment of women, because the women have the time to do it. So there you have a kind of perverse relationship with women participation. It's good, but on the other side, they can do it because they are not economically included. The second one is about the presence of the state, and I agree with you. It's just only not a question of bringing back the state, but it's how the state is brought back. Okay, I think that's the crucial question. But I think I think what is crucial for the people of the community is that they can develop citizenship, and they need the state to be there. Now, the other question is if the state they allow them to develop citizenship on the others, or on the contrary, they remain as main clients. Like that's a crucial political issue.
First about police change. The Latin American has a number of police forces. In the case of Mexico, you have hundreds of police forces. So there are no general rules applicable to all of them. However, you you have seen a number of positive changes in some cases. Colombia is one case. I mean, the Colombian police is not what it used to be in the 90s. Chile is another case in the sense that I believe the levels of abuse and human rights violations have gone down tremendously, partly because of democracy itself, and partly because of a criminal justice system which is more aggressive and capable of investigating things. Now, I would say a few things that trying to compile what myself and others have written about it. I would say that to reform the police, you have to go everywhere, and that requires a sequencing of changes. It requires, changing the admission process, the process of education and continuing educating the police officer. It requires information and management tools. It requires then the use of information in operative terms and whatever. I mean, so you have to begin somewhere, but you have to be aware that you have to do a number of things, and that is very difficult to do. The second thing I would say is that there are no receipts for this. I mean, community policing is not going to change the police. It might change the relationship between the police and a particular community, but that program is not going to transform the culture of the police as a whole. Thirdly, I would say is that you need to balance political direction of the police and yet operational independence from political will. The police cannot be autonomous like it has been in many countries, but it cannot be at the very same time, just a political instrument, because each of these poles is really detrimental. So I would say that instead of looking at successes, we need to look at failures. Why is it that the Salvadorian police, that was such a great experiment at the very beginning, in which many countries contributed, and you brought people from the armed forces as well as from the guerrillas, is no longer a success story. Might tell you more about how to deal with these very critical cases. Now, the last thing I would say is that you need a police system. You don't have a police system in Mexico. And they're trying to create one by creating a very strong federal police, but that hasn't worked. So you need to have coordination, you need to have basics of a system. Okay, the role of the questions dealing with communities is in fact something that we are researching right now in our project, because our project has applied a survey in around 60 communities in each of the cities. And we are analyzing the qualitative data on 2 communities in each of the cities, we are looking much more in depth there. So I don't have news with respect to that. With respect to the insecurity, the perception of insecurity, I mean, there's so much written about it. One thing is, it depends on how you measure it. I mean, which questions you apply. Sometimes when you are asking, what is the most important public problem that you feel should be, managed by the government, or better managed by the government, the question of insecurity is really compared to other issues. That is to say, When the perception about the economy or education is good, security tends to take the first place. When we had, demonstrations dealing with the public education in 2011, insecurity became the third or fourth major problem. So that's one thing. The second thing is that I would say insecurity is linked to the perception of the effectiveness of the police and the judiciary. I mean, it deals with crimes that have happened and crimes that might happen. And therefore, the perception there, and unless you might reduce crime, but unless you improve that perception, you won't improve the problem. And the last issue is the perception of insecurity is related to a certain starting point. For instance, in Bogota, the perception of insecurity is better than in Santiago. Why? Because crime went down, despite now being higher than in Santiago, violent crime. So there are many issues to consider, but I haven't seen really a successful public policy to deal with that, at least in the region.
Jennifer?
Thanks. Some fascinating questions, and I don't think I'm going to have time to touch on all of them, and I'm not sure that I'm the right person to touch on all of them, but there are a couple that I want to pick up on, and I'm going to talk a lot about women, because in a previous career, I did a bunch of research on women in policing and gender in situations of fragility, so this is kind of my wheelhouse, and any excuse to get to talk about it. But just quickly, I think that in terms of good news stories, and I'm not an expert on this topic in the region, but I have seen some, and perhaps colleagues can comment on this, who are a bit more knowledgeable, but in good news stories when it comes to policing, I know that sort of globally, we see improvements in policing when a gender-sensitive approach is taken and when more women are integrated into the police, so that police services or police forces are more reflective of the communities that they are meant to serve. And there have been really interesting, with pros and cons, successes and room for improvement, initiatives within Latin America to create women's police stations. So police stations that are developed to be much more welcoming and respectful of women. And I think that there have been some modest successes in that regard. There's quite a comprehensive study coordinated by Nadine Jubb and partners in the region. And I could find the reference for you, but I don't have it off the top of my head. And then in terms of the role in women in communities, I think looking across not just these three projects, but more broadly within Safe and Inclusive Cities, a number of things are coming out, some of which I think, is just being validated and reinforced around the differences in terms of femininities and masculinities and the social roles that we ascribe to women and the social roles that we ascribe to men. And really pulling out, yes, women are often victims of violence, but women also are agents. And I think that that's in really fascinating ways coming out of all three of these projects. The roles that women have to play in both perpetuating violence and reinforcing violence, or being agents of violence themselves, but also in terms of being agents of prevention and through society creating an expectation of peace and nonviolence. One thing that I wanted to highlight that I don't think has come up, but is really a challenge, I think, for all of us is how we measure violence. I think the tendency, because we can count it easily, is to focus on homicide rates. But really, and I think this is probably coming out of all these projects and certainly in the others, is that a lot of the violence that we see in cities is actually domestic violence. And so many of the projects are engaging with sort of what are the dynamics, how does the urban influence domestic violence, and what are the dynamics there. And then lastly, I would just say in terms of sort of that role and how to create more space for women to be positive actors in communities, that there's a great opportunity for learning among these projects and other projects in the cohort, and with sort of under the heading of South-South learning. I don't know that there's necessarily a lot that we, as the global North, can teach or can share. perhaps there is, and it'd be really interesting to have a conversation around that. But I think there's a lot of potential to learn from contexts that are dealing with very similar challenges in other countries that are not necessarily Canada or the United States. Thanks.
Wow. First of all, we've got to stop talking about police as some kind of a generic term. Obviously, you need community police, but let's not be naive. We need professional, specialized police who can deal with a very sophisticated set of contexts that we're dealing in now. Police that can do complicated financial investigations, police that can help us with cyber, gangs, organized crime, etc. So to me, the real sweet spot here is professionalization, meritocracy, and creating a vocation around the police. If in some countries you're paying them below poverty rate, what do you expect? And if we as citizens have come to think of the police as part of the problem and to be avoided at all costs, how much are we contributing to the problem? And I would think of simple things, quality of life laws like seatbelts, stop signs, respecting sort of normal conventions. Those are things that in many countries have come adrift. I would also say that I was struck when, and I might disagree with my Canadian colleague, I'm Canadian as well, there are some things I think that the global north can share. And just a few weeks ago, the new Toronto City Police Chief was introduced, Caribbean background, by the Police Community Service Board chair. And this is a board that supervises the police that's made up of the community. Is it perfect? Is the Toronto Police perfect? No. But these are cities that have homicide rates of under 1 over 100,000. There isn't, I don't think, another country in the region that even comes close. And there are some things that Canada, in its federalist approach to policing and prevention and education, can, I think, share that would be very useful. I also think in the Canadian and context, the corrections services, just the name corrections services, is a very useful model. Is it perfect? No. But is it something that we can help share across other jurisdictions? I actually think that there's something in that. I agree with my colleagues. What I have seen, Carabineros de Chile, experiments in Colombia. I'm very optimistic. There's a club, if you will, of police chiefs called Ameripol, which is a lot modeled on Europol, which if you think about, the fall of the Iron Curtain and the assimilation of many other different countries with asymmetrical approaches to policing and quality, Europol has done a great job of trying to raise the standards and create some kind of organic culture around policing with great success, and now is working on improving the technical competencies to deal with some of these very complex issues that we face and cross-border issues that we face, whereas somebody else here mentioned trust and confidence is really essential. The perception thing, to my view, is a really good question, and it comes around indicators. We're using the wrong indicators. We're asking the wrong questions. If all we're focused on is tons of drugs seized, how many people we throw in jail, how many arrests we make, how many homicides we've had, we're losing track of what matters to people. In places like Canada and elsewhere, we're starting to look at things like well-being. Of course, in newly affluent, emerging middle-class communities who do not want to go back to that map that somebody showed here of Caracas, one side and Caracas the other side. I mean, if you've got to one side, you don't want to go back. So I think we have to start looking at indicators. I mean, how many community centers are there? How many social workers are there? What kind of diversion programs exist? What's the level of education, early childhood education? Those are the things that we need to start measuring in a much better way.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. I want to thank American University and Eric Hirschberg and IDRC for their role here as well, and Floxo and all our colleagues. Join me with, Cindy has a, and Blair Rubel from our Urban Institute here at the Wilson Center. He wasn't able to be here today, but we appreciate his support as well. Join me in thanking our panelists, please. Thank you. And now I think we're free for coffee and pastry. They knew there were two Canadians and a Minnesotan up here, so they cranked up the air conditioning where